All right. You ready to go, Tom?
Yes, you go ahead, Anthony. Over to you.
All right. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this virtual grand round. This is our second virtual grand round of the year. I've got Angela Nolan, the CEO, with me here today. And we're very happy to welcome everyone to this grand round. So basically, COVID-19 infection has challenged the way we provide care to our patients. And it's precipitated a number of clinical problems to be solved, ranging from social distancing of patients and each other, shortage of equipment and PPE, evaluation of risks from certain procedures and how to avoid those risks, and also novel uses of available equipment and technology. But although COVID-19 has made us think laterally and pushed us to adopt change, the types of issues that we're dealing with are not novel. They're the sort of problems that we face each day, but perhaps we haven't had the time, the impetus, or the connections to solve. And some of these problems have had solutions available, but we haven't adopted them. And telehealth is one example where, forced to adopt it, we've done it with vigour. And similarly, the way we're doing this grand round today virtually is another example. But others require novel technological solutions, and for this to occur, someone needs to identify the problem that needs to be solved and then source the help that they need to solve that problem. And this is the concept that underpins the ACMD, which hopefully will be kicking off later off this year, or at least the start of the building. A biomedical engineering centre where clinicians and engineers can come together to identify and solve clinical problems through translational research, design and marketing. In this virtual lecture, innovators will present their ideas and how they've collaborated to solve clinical problems. We'll then have a discussion about how to kindle the right interaction and remove barriers to innovation. And we hope to clarify how engineers and technologists will help us connect with clinicians. So I've got three speakers here today. We've got Jason Monti from Mechanical Engineering at the University of Melbourne, who's going to talk about ventilation hoods for hospital beds. Got Claudia DeBella from St. V's in the university, who's going to talk about 3D printing of PPE. And we've got Carl O'Connell, from a researcher from the RMIT that also works at Biofab. He's going to talk about the challenges in innovation. And then we've got a panel here who can help tie this all together. We have Fiona McCormick, who's from the TPA, David Graydon, who's the Clifford Professor of Neural Engineering at the University of Melbourne, John Darby, our ID physician, Davis McCarthy, who's a statistician at SVI, Simon Craig, who's the General Manager of Continuous Improvement, was really in charge of procurement during the COVID, and had a crash course in how to procure goods and the barriers to procuring goods. And we've also got Andrew Wilson here, the Chief Medical Officer for Victoria. So we got Jason here. Yes, we have got Jason here. So we'll kick off with Jason, who's going to talk about ventilation hoods for hospital beds. Jason, are you still on mute? Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, great.
Okay. Am I sharing my screen?
Yep, terrific.
Okay, cool. So Tom said to take 10 to 15 minutes, so hopefully I won't be longer than that, and hope that's okay. Just tell me to hurry up if not.
Yep.
Okay, so my name is Professor Jason Monti. I am the head of the Department of Mechanical Engineering, and I'm a fluid dynamics researcher. So just briefly, just to give you a bit of perspective from where we come from, we have a huge fluid dynamics group. I won't go into the details, but we're separated in two halves, experimental and simulation. I'm on the experimental side, so we do lots of wind tunnel experiments, but it's a big group. We mainly do large-scale engineering research under these three categories. So we're not used to the medtech space. We do have a small collaboration, I guess, in the cardiovascular area, which is not led by me. It's led by a simulator, Andrew Uy, who's a professor and he does computational fluid dynamics. So he's done some really cool work in collaboration with Biotronic and Medtronic and Peter Barlas at the Northern Hospital. And they've done some great work on flow visualization and flow measurement and prediction through blood vessels in connection with stents. But that's largely research, not so much development. Okay, but what you want to hear about is what we've done recently during this pandemic. So I just thought I'd take you through the timeline. I think it's a pretty cool story. Let's see how we go. So on March 23rd, we got a call from Forbes McCain from Western Health. He's an anaesthetist and an ICU physician. They also did his PhD at Melbourne a few years back. We had a second phone call the day after where we had a design brief put to us, which was very, very basic. It was just, we need to isolate patients to protect the healthcare workers. We need some access to the patients. We need it to be safe and easily removed. We talked a lot about negative pressure rooms, which is the preferred isolation solution. Now I've got lots of, as a fluid dynamicist, I can talk to you all day about negative pressure isolation, but I'll leave that out for now. The problem that we thought in a pandemic is that a negative pressure room doesn't actually protect the healthcare worker from the patient, of course, because the healthcare worker will be exposed when they come to attend to the patient. So unless they're wearing full PPE, they won't be protected. Of course, they are useful. They protect the rest of the hospital from transmission. So I'm not saying anything bad about negative pressure isolation. It's just that we were asked to come up with a larger solution, or a solution for more patients. So we looked at what else was out there, and we saw these Italian bubble helmets, and there was a UK design, and these both had some significant problems. One is that I looked at that as an engineer and thought, well, that's really just too complicated for what it appears to me needs to be done. And the biggest problem is that these are sealed units. So you require constant airflow from an external source, or the patient will asphyxiate, which is a pretty severe consequence. Okay, so we thought, what can we do about that? And so we came up, I began designing, didn't have much time for this. They wanted a prototype a couple of days later. Something, I guess, fortuitous in a sense happened at that time. There was a full lab closure at the University of Melbourne on March 25th. And that's a problem for us because my work is all experimental in a laboratory. So I had this whole team of guys that I pay that were suddenly doing nothing. And so we put them to use and got them to work on this hood. So these are pretty talented guys. Two of those are technicians and the other two are engineers, research engineers. And together in about 24 hours, we built the first prototype, which I'll show you a video of if it works.
Hey guys, looking at Melbourne Uni isolation.
Can you hear?
Mark 1.
Yeah.
So the patient would be lying where the table is. This is a hood that can just be easily pulled up.
Fan ducting to HEPA filter.
So it's a very basic device. Essentially, it's just got a duct at the top that you can see there that sucks the air around the patient. And the important thing is the key features are it's not sealed. So the patient can lie there, and if the fan breaks or something stops working, I've got evidence that there's absolutely no danger to the patient. In fact, it's not even that uncomfortable. And the HEPA filter is the other key. The HEPA filter is what's commonly used in hospitals and filters out 99.97% of particles or droplets. Okay, so that's the basic design. A day later, we demonstrated that first prototype at Footscray ICU, and the nurses were, I've never seen people so happy to see me. The nurses were very excited and gave us lots of great feedback. We went back, and on the weekend, we looked at what worked and what didn't work. It was mostly a good design, which was highly fortuitous. But one of the big problems was that the hood itself was very difficult for us to make because we're not sewing experts. So we got Rose Chong Costumes to sew the hood over the weekend, which saved us a lot of time. And an important thing was that we recently built up a manufacturing and supply chain research group in mechanical engineering, and we engaged them to help us with the manufacturing concurrently as we were still building. Okay, by Tuesday we had Mark II, and I'll just zoom in on that, and you can see that it's got a clear back now, the Perspex made back, and a better filtration system, and it's just a little bit more refined. This is essentially what we finished with. So this is only about 4 or 5 days after we started. Sorry. We then went to the Northern Hospital, and they were also very excited. And this is where I started to realize that there was this thing probably had some legs, because everybody I was showing it to was telling me that this is not only useful for COVID, but it could be useful further down the track, which I'll describe a little bit later. We then engaged Evan Evans. So Rose Chong said she could only make 20. And then we went to Evan Evans, which is a local flag manufacturer, started in 1877 in Melbourne, still a family operated business. And they agreed to pretty much make the whole thing. Then we demonstrated, and that was obviously a big stepping stone because it got it out of our lab. We're not manufacturers and into a manufacturing plant. Of course, they're not a medical device company, so that's got its own issues, which we can talk about later. We then demonstrated, I can't see the screen anymore, demonstrated the third prototype, I think that says, at Footscray. And that was pretty much the final prototype that we have today that was taken for manufacturing. Okay, so that was about 11 days. It was pretty hectic. After that, we were pretty much stopped because the university said, and rightly said, we cannot just send this to hospitals, even if we can make it, because we need to get through the TGA and the regulatory requirements. So as I said in the beginning, I'm no expert in med tech. I'm an engineer, usually works in wind tunnels. We don't do development of devices, even in an engineering setting. So I didn't know anything about this, and I'm learning a lot of things that I never wanted to know and still don't want to know. It's a tough road. And I shouldn't say it's a tough road. It's a very uncertain road because everything's changing so fast at this time. Perhaps it's becoming more certain. Again, we could talk about that later. But an exciting development of all this was that there are a whole bunch of research projects that we stumbled across with this hood. And also I should point out that clinical trials are agreed with Western Health and the ethics application is submitted. So clinical trials should be able to start in a couple of weeks, we hope. That allows us to get the devices into Footscray because that's been registered with the TGA as well for clinical trials, but it does not obviously allow us to large scale roll out these devices. Okay, so a really important thing is that this has led to research questions. And for the university, this is a big deal because our core business is teaching and research. It's not production of or any devices, not production of medical devices. So it was really important to me that for this to be a long-term, for this to have long-term legs inside the university, we needed to have some research questions. And they came about very quickly. They were very obvious. One thing I was pointing out to people is that we have a group that works on aircraft fuel injection sprays. And I've always known that's a very difficult area and it's very complicated. There's a lot of people working on it. And I made the point that we know more about aircraft fuel injection sprays than we do about sneeze and cough droplets, from what I've read, which is kind of the wrong place to be right now. Don't need those aircraft fuel injection much. So there are a lot of questions on aerosol generation and transport. There are very few studies on mitigation devices other than negative pressure isolation rooms. And what we found really interesting is that there's a poor understanding of the risks associated with some of these aerosol generating procedures, which in some cases, at least is my understanding, that some of these procedures are not being used because of the risk of aerosolization. But the very little research done on actually on exactly how much aerosol is generated, where does it go, is the virus viable on it, etc. So there's a lot of interesting work to be done there. And then on negative pressure isolation rooms, from a fluid dynamics point of view, I think there's a lot of problems there. There's a lot of, there doesn't seem to be any smart sensing or even maintenance of the rooms. And by maintenance, I don't mean, I'm not having a go at hospital engineers here. I'm saying a designer designs a negative pressure isolation room, but then over time, things change, beds change, furniture changes, instruments change. I believe the negative pressure isolation room in Footscray was built in the 1980s, and I don't have a picture, but I'm sure the infrastructure in the room was a lot different. The instrumentation in the room was a lot different. On top of that, staff didn't seem to know where the airflow was going, and I pointed out to staff that I don't think you should be walking past that vent, and they weren't aware that that's actually where the virus would, exactly the path of the virus, or any aerosol borne, or any aerosol. So I think there's some real work to be done on negative pressure isolation rooms. There's a lot of assumptions, and there's a lack of understanding of how those work. I'm not saying this is anyone's fault. It's not an easy thing. What happens to a negative pressure room when you put six healthcare workers instead of one? What does the heat load do to the room? Where does virus get stuck in corners of the room? All those questions they're real fluid dynamics questions, and I can tell you they're not easy to answer, but it would help if we started working on it.
Thanks, Jason.
Okay.
Do you have much more to go?
I don't. These are my key points.
Yep.
So I'll just run through these really quickly. It was a really unique set of circumstances that we have, this pandemic, obviously. The team we had was just right, and we stumbled on a device that has use beyond COVID-19. I'll leave these. Perhaps I can give the slides if anybody's interested. And the takeaway points is that the collaboration was key. We had a whole bunch of people, clinicians, the hospitals were interested, the engineers were all keen, and we had manufacturers on board, which was partly because the manufacturers, Evan Evans, had a whole lot of staff sitting around with nothing to do. So happy to help. I'll leave lack of funding. Regulation is a big issue. I know many of my colleagues who have responded fast and then been very disappointed that they can't get their devices into hospitals because they didn't realize that what the regulatory process was. And this is the last slide. I think that there are some bigger issues that we need to look at, and I hope I'm not stepping out of line in saying these. I think we need new solutions. I think there's a lot of focus on security of existing solutions, which is all understandable because we've been in a crisis and we didn't have time to prepare. But now that we can look to the future, I think we need to think about things, solutions to solve problems when existing solutions rather will not work. So for example, I got calls about negative pressure isolation room from just about every hospital, and that's not a solution for a pandemic. You can't build hundreds of negative pressure isolation rooms. It's just not going to happen. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I could talk about this for a long time, but I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Jason. That's terrific work in a short time, and also you raised some really important questions that really need to be answered in the coming months and years. We'll move on now to Claudia Di Bella, who's going to talk about 3D printing of PPE.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Claudia Di Bella. I'm an orthopedic surgeon at St. Vincent's and associate professor of surgery at the University of Melbourne. I have no slides. It will be just a quick description of what we did. And again, we go back to March, and it's a fairly similar story to what Jason was describing in terms of how quick and how fast the response was, obviously because of the situation. With the University of Melbourne and the BioFab 3D, which is a biofabrication facility at St. Vincent's Hospital, and it is a coordinated work with multiple universities. My lab is does cartilage tissue engineering. So we 3D print and bioprint tissues. In my case, called musculoskeletal regeneration. So it's something that has absolutely nothing to do with COVID. But at that time, and also me being Italian, I was quite linked with what was happening overseas. There was obviously a very high worries and obviously a strong request for PPEs, and we didn't know whether we had enough at the time. So everything actually started as a tweet between me and Cahal, because I had I saw what was happening in Italy, and that everyone was wearing some face shields, which were very basic protection devices. Really all I did was sending a tweet to Cahal O'Connell, who is gonna talk next to me after me, was now the lab manager of the BioFab 3D. And all I said was sending a picture and say, can we do anything like that? And it took a day to have a prototype of a face shield, which are these fairly simple devices that can be 3D printed in terms of the skeleton in itself can be printed, and then everything else is just some elastic wires for hair and just some clear covers that we purchased from office work. So similar to what Jason was describing, the design needed to be very, very simple, something that could be delivered straight away, and without too many complications in terms of production and cost, because the other thing that the researchers wanted was to give that as a gift for the healthcare workers. So it wasn't thought to be anything that needed to go to TGA approval or anything. It was simply for protection. That obviously, just like Jason again was saying, the formalities needed to be taken in consideration, as well as the approval from TGA. So I think we're still working on that. But the difference that was our story was that the request came from really the grassroots. So as doctors and me as a surgeon, we felt that we could even simply just give that as an extra protection to anyone, not necessarily not for people that were directly in contact with patients with COVID, but for everyone else that works still in clinics and in the admin that has a face-to-face contact with patients, nursing staff, junior medical doctors that are again just for face-to-face approach. So that was it was a good feel story in terms of what can be done by simply wanting to help. And once that movement started, a number of universities across Australia started collaborating, and the beauty of all of that was that collaboration was really moving away from IPs and protection of their own ideas and patents. What was simply a will to help. And in fact, all the designs of the CAD designs for these masks were all free to share for everyone. So if anyone wanted to print one for themselves at home, they could, and they still can. And I think that this was something that taught us how nice it is to simply, step up and help on a time when, we don't really need to think too much of protection of ideas and what is mine and what is yours. So it's something that, taught me a lot, and we still have some of these masks free for everyone that just asks us. But obviously, and this is one of the things that I would like Cathal then to touch on, we still need to think about the obstacles on distribution in the, with the formalities of approvals, and especially the TGA approval for something that is in times when the time is not there, when we don't have time to work through all of these bureaucratic steps, which understand often are very, very absolutely necessary. So this is just our story, and I'm sure that Cathal will be able to then go further in detail on this, and I'm happy to take any question.
Thanks, Claudia. That's really good, just to demonstrate the sort of the organic nature of the interaction between clinicians and engineers and technologists. And I think it's a reminder that we've got people on the campus who, if they actually talk to each other, they can solve problems in a very short time. Just a reminder to the audience that there is a Q&A button there. So if you have questions that you want to ask any of our speakers or any of our panel, just to write them down there, and we'll get you to read out those questions later on. Okay, so finally we've got Cathal O'Connell, who's a researcher from RMIT, and he's also used to, as we heard, was at BioFab as well. And Cathal's going to talk about some of the challenges of innovation. Thanks, Cathal.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Anthony. So let me just get my slides up. Okay, I'm sharing now. Can you guys see? Okay.
Yep, good.
Yeah, yeah, you can see. Okay. Yeah, there's a baby in the background. Apologies for that. Anyway, I'll just kind of follow on from Claudia. So she's told the initiation of where this problem came from, and as we've heard already, there has been a mobilization of university researchers around Australia, around the world, really, in response to this challenge. So we heard already about the ventilation hoods, an amazing story. There's also a lot of work around creating splitters so that a ventilator can be used for multiple patients, and lots of stories at various stages of development and various levels of complexity. But what I'd like to do for a few minutes is just focus on probably the simplest story and the simplest device going around, and that is the face shield that but firstly, you know, another thing that I guess the first challenge in all of this is identifying the right problem and making sure that there is useful communication between the researchers and the clinicians who are identifying the problems, as Claudia just did. So there are different. No, this has kind of been building up from an ad hoc process, and I've been working with Jason Tren and Jazz Coles-Black at the Austin, who being vascular surgeons, being clinicians themselves, they felt that they needed a process for how to identify these problems. And so in the early stages of this crisis, they just built a simple Google form online, and they started collecting problems from clinicians, firstly at the Austin, but then at other hospitals too, and linking up with researchers who they felt would be able to solve that problem. And that has led to some solutions being implemented in the clinic, and perhaps David Graydon can mention some of those. And that grew into a more public-facing endeavor there. A website was created, covidsos.com.au, as a way to kind of nationalize this process of identifying problems. So either clinicians could come on and nominate a problem that they're facing, as well as industry and researchers could come on as well from the other side and say, I can help with this. I can design that. I can manufacture whatever. And that was designed to be a kind of a marketplace to make these connections between both ends. It was launched with a lot of promise, but in the end, that project was put on hold because it was flooded so much by people from the community who may not who have a 3D printer in their garage or something. So a lot of well-meaning people, but who don't necessarily have the connections or the rigor required to solve these problems properly. And so we had to actually pause that. That's a communication issue that has been one obstacle. Now let's focus on the face shields for a second. So as I mentioned, it's a very, very simple device, just a very simple barrier to stop splashes of droplets, coughing and sneezing and so on. Standard versions are single use. They cost about $1 or so. They're classed as a class 1 non-sterile device. And let's look at this as a kind of a case study in mobilizing Australian manufacturing. As we've seen, global supply chains may not be so stable in a time of crisis. What if we need to produce this stuff in mass quantities rapidly here locally? Can we do it? And I think it's kind of a canary if we can't do that, because it's such a simple device, with low levels, low regulation requirements, very, very easy to make. And if we can't solve that, then how are we going to solve the bigger problems? So and this is the kind of problem that we're seeing highlighted in the media. Staff at hospitals who are actually producing their own PPE, even in Australia, just using stationery. So 3D printing can help. This video here is showing a face shield being created in our lab. 3D printing can help because prototypes can be drawn up on a computer very quickly, and they can be printed in 1 or 2 hours. The design can be iterated, and the designs can be freely shared. They can be just emailed to one another, and modifications can be made, and different people trying them out, that's the kind of process that we've been involved in. The designs that I'll talk about have been worked on by many people around the world in this manner, and ultimately getting tested by clinicians in the field to check if they're up to spec. So as Claudia mentioned, this is a very simple structure. It's just the 3D printed component. There's these plastic sheets from Officeworks, and just some hairbands that we assemble together. And once the printed part is made, it's very easy to put it together in a couple of minutes. So the idea originally originated in Czech Republic, where a 3D printing company came up with this first design, which has now been improved upon and adopted around the world, basically. So we're jumping on that and producing our own designs that are suited to the Australian clinicians. Even in the US, there have been designs that have been recommended by the National Institute of Health, and they actually host these designs on their website to be downloaded and printed around the US. So at BioFab, we have teamed up with RMIT after trialing some initial designs, and we've produced these in the hundreds of quantities, and with contacts like Claudia and other clinicians around the hospital, we've been distributing these as required. So and as I mentioned, doing this prototyping phase. So that's actually been the main role of BioFab. Because we're a 3D printing lab actually on a hospital site, it means that we can receive designs from engineers in different universities, print them out very quickly, and get real surgeons, real clinicians to trial them. And so we've been able to give some very important feedback back to those universities too. And we've also been producing our own designs that have been meeting unmet needs in the community. This is Eric Levi, an ENT surgeon. They use a particular type of loop called a Vorotech instrument for looking in eyes and ears and so on. And that doesn't fit under any of the standard designs. So we kind of helped out. We modified some of the designs to produce something that would allow this to fit underneath, and that's been very successful. We've distributed these also in the hundreds around Australia, and we've had requests for this file from London, from Canada as well, and freely we're able to send those around, and they're getting produced around the world too. So this is not unique to Australia. Different states have approached the problem in different ways, and it's interesting to just focus quickly on what the outcomes have been. In Queensland, for example, there was a big initiative led by the Hurston Biofabrication Institute at QUT, where they decided to go with the community sourcing approach, where they rallied schools and individual people with printers to print these face shields out and then send them in. They obtained about 3,000 in the first week, and then up to about 15,000 through their community drop-off center program. They had a lot of buy-in from Queensland Health. Obviously, the Minister of Health here is being pictured holding one of the shields. So there was communication early on at the state health level, and that allowed them to get these distributed into hospitals. Now, whether or not this sourcing from the community is an issue from the regulatory point of view, that remains to be seen, because one of the self-assessment processes around these devices is that you need to be able to guarantee the quality and that the devices are being produced to certain protocols, which is very difficult to do when you're community sourcing, of course. Then in New South Wales, there was another effort, more centralized, with local industry and university, producing thousands of shields, a plan to upscale to tens of thousands a week going beyond 3D printing there. 3D printing can produce maybe hundreds a day or so, or thousands a day maybe, if you have a lot of printers. But if you really want to produce tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, you need a different manufacturing method, like injection molding, which is the same way that Lego blocks are made, for example. So that's critical to mass manufacture, but it requires a lot of initial capital to get that going. And so that's been, you need to have the guarantee that these tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands are going to be used before that capital is really being spent. So far, most of the production in Australia, or indeed all of it, has been through 3D printing alone. Now, the next step, talking about that step of mass manufacturing, we've seen big players like Toyota, like Ford, investing their resources and their different technologies of producing these at very large numbers. Ford committed to producing 100,000 and delivering them for free across Australia. There was a Toyota design that was capable of producing 25,000 per day. We've also had communication with a lot of local industries who are offering injection molding capabilities. So the pieces are in place there to take the next step beyond 3D printing and have this mass manufacture locally in Australia in a scalable fashion. And all of these stories that I've mentioned, they've all got a lot of media attention, but are they really realistic? So we've mentioned the TGA and the regulation. Again, this is a very, very simple device, and the TGA have actually been very clear on the requirements for these kind of face shields. They've been quite good to work with, and they've been producing up-to-date advice. This is a class 1 medical device at the lowest risk of classification. Basically, you need a quality management system that is self-certified, and there's no independent audit required. And the application to get this a device listed on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods can be processed in about a day. So it's very quick. And what we've seen in the last 2 months is 122 new face shield designs have been listed. And before that, before the 1st of March, ever, there'd only been 32 designs. So basically we've quintupled the number of face shield designs in Australia in the last 2 months. However, that doesn't mean that everybody wants to take that route. We've seen some universities have been very reluctant to put their name down on these kind of applications because you are assuming responsibility as a manufacturer. Now, in the end, I'm going to pull this to a close now with a kind of a bit of a downer what's been happening in Victoria anyway in the last week or so. Maybe there are other people on this call who have better information than I do about what's been happening. But my understanding is that hospitals in Victoria, they're not allowed to purchase outside of the central supply chain. And my information is that the Department of Health here in Victoria have actually rejected that offer from Ford around those face shields. And the Toyota have their interest has waned too because they're not seeing those big orders from states. And instead, HPV have secured a large order from China, which is basically the status quo design, the same kind of thing that they've been using for a long time. Feedback from clinicians is that it's not the preferred design that they would like, but anyway, that's the status quo, and it's the right price basically. The same kind of story is happening in New South Wales. That 3D printing company that I mentioned before, there's a quote from them where they have 1,000 face shields in stock that they've just started giving out to hairdressers and bakeries and so on, because they haven't had communication with state procurement groups. Now, as I said, Queensland is a bit better, and I think Western Australia is a bit better too. So every state is kind of having a different response to this crisis. And I apologize if my information here is out of date, but maybe there are other people on the call who have more better information than I do on this. So overall, I think we've seen some small wins. Certainly, we've been distributing in the hundreds and in the thousands these face shields to individual clinicians, and they're getting used in the clinic. But getting through the front door has been a challenge, and not necessarily at the hospital level, but at the state level, certainly in in Victoria. We have identified problems, we've solved technical problems, manufacturing problems, and regulatory problems, but the actual purchasing, the centralized system, and the communication problems have been an issue. At least that's the feeling that I've got from our collaborators across this COVID SOS network, and I'm very happy to hear any good news that I may have missed, and address any questions on this. But that's basically my story for you today. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Cahal. That's great, and it's disappointing that all that good work and seems to have been thwarted in its infancy. But we'll probably hear from some people that can probably give us some more background on that. I just encourage people, if there are questions, to put them on the Q&A, and we'll get to you. But I might just start off by asking Fiona if she can comment on the TGA's oversight and response to these sort of projects.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I have to say I've been working at the TGA in the medical devices branch for 14 years, and I have never seen such an active and focused mobilisation of getting things through that really need to be, as far as addressing shortage of supplies for the COVID pandemic. So the information that you've actually expressed is all accurate. Most of these devices are low class. So when we're talking about class 1 non-sterile medical devices, such as the face shields, they are considered low risk, and it's a straightforward process to get approval to supply them in Australia. So that's what you need when you have the ARTG inclusion. The biggest responsibility, yes, is on the manufacturer, but that's really them recognising that they've considered all of the risks and that they believe that their device is not going to cause any harm. It's safe, it's going to perform as intended. So really, when you're talking about low-risk devices, it's not onerous, but yes, we do need someone to take responsibility for that and make sure that they've got mechanisms in place to follow up if something does go wrong, because that's part of the process. It's not just the initial manufacture, but it's following the medical device through the entire process, okay, making sure that there's mechanisms in place to catch things that go wrong, because manufacturing processes are never perfect.
Thanks, Fiona. I might just go to Andrew Wilson. Are you able to make any comments, Andrew, on Cahal's sort of problems that he's had in terms of manufacturing? Question without notice, if you're still there.
I was on mute. Sorry about that. Thanks everyone for inviting me. So about 3 weeks ago, we formed a PPE task force in the department. So a lot of these discussions weren't joined up, to be honest. And so I now get to see, I'm the chair of that, and John Darby, who's on the line, is a member of it as an expert advisor on infectious diseases. So we are actually having quite positive discussions with HPV, who order these devices, and feeding into the through clinicians and other experts into what sort of things they should be ordering. We also meet with the economic development part of the government, so they are keen to support this kind of activity. So part of it's just trying to understand the bureaucracy, which hopefully our committee is working on in a positive way for people. But we are aware of some of these things, and we talk about them, and so I don't think it's a hopeless situation that these things will never be used or anything like that. And the situation has changed over the last couple of weeks. One of the things to consider is that hopefully next week we'll be able to get something out to everyone, but we're drafting up a strategy document which is similar to what the CDC in the US has put out, where we've published the guidance for what we call conventional supply of PPE, but sitting behind that is what we're calling alternative and unconventional supply. So we are drafting up a strategy, which I'd like to release publicly, where we talk about what happens if we run out of certain PPE, which some of this would fit into. So that the discussion about alternative approaches and manufacturing things that what we choose originally, is definitely a live one. I have to say, having seen the ordering is a complex process, and so it has been really positive for HPV to interact with us. So the scale of masks, I mean, masks alone for the end of the year, it's 1 billion masks. I mean, the number of masks they're ordering is enormous. And so it's hard to turn it around quickly. So they have to commit to things, 4, 6, 8 weeks in advance, and everyone's scrambling to order as many of these things as we can. One of the other benefits is I've got some visibility through the committee on how many masks we're ordering, but also face shields and gowns and things. So it's not all, I know those who are interested in this understand, masks is one part of the PPE, but then there's other parts of it. So we might be doing well on masks, but not so well on one of the other things. So gowns, for example, where there's a lot of interest in alternative strategies around gowns. So it's very complicated, but there is a mechanism to have those conversations, and they're actively happening. So please don't be turned off innovation. And we are planning strategies. Hopefully we never get there, but you're probably all aware we've been putting used PPE aside, just looking at sterilisation solutions if we ever needed to do that. So we're trying to be strategic and planning ahead for worst case scenario.
Thanks, Andrew. Simon, Craig, did you want to comment on the purchasing process and interaction with HPV?
Yeah, I think Andrew made some really good points there, and I think what's happening at the state level, we're doing as well within our own hospital. I suspect a lot of hospitals are doing the same, which is trying to join all the dots. It's not just our procurement and supply chain, but infection control, how we actually use the product in the clinical areas, all things that we need to be considering. For me, Jason raised a really good, really interesting point, and perhaps something that we can take forward, which is how we've got problems that we're trying to solve now in the middle of a pandemic, and how do we make sure that moving forward we don't lose these problems and we actually do solve them, and perhaps more importantly create the environments where in the future we could see these problems and solve them into the future, so that we're not waiting for the problem, a pandemic to occur before we start to solve these problems. And what we're doing at a local level now is we're trying to create those cross-functional groups, as Andrew kind of suggested at the state level seems to be doing the same, which is creating these cross-functional groups so that we have all the different parts of the, I was going to say supply chain, but it's much broader than the supply chain, all the different parts of the PPE life, if you like, covered, so that we're short-circuiting what can be very long processes, so that we know when we need to turn on the alternate use of PPE. As Andrew suggested, we've already flagged that N95 masks are going to be a problem if we do hit the peaks that we expected, and so we are holding those and exploring alternate use options. But those things happen because we grab the different leaders from different parts of the life cycle of PPE together to identify what is the big problem we need to solve.
Thanks, Simon. Kahal, how do we get in touch with people like you? How do clinicians with good ideas, meet with you and get to share ideas and come up with plans to solve problems?
Yeah. So specifically in response to COVID, we kind of redesigned our website, biofab3d.org, to have a contact form right there. Anybody who has this kind of problem at clinician or healthcare worker, I'd encourage you to go straight on to biofab3d.org and just fill out that form that goes straight to our personal email addresses, and we can start that communication. Now that's kind of an ad hoc response. It would be much better to have a formal and robust communication channel for dealing with future problems, but that's what we have at the moment.
And I suppose some of those more formal communications will come, once we have got something like the ACMD up and running, where people are sort of brushing shoulders every day with clinicians and engineers, and those sort of ideas will be solved in the cafeteria, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Tom, sorry, Anthony, just one quickie. So Stanford, where Tom's worked, looked at for the ACMD, I mean, they formalise it. I think you do need to consider formalising those groups. They have groups of clinicians, engineers and venture capital people who are actually meeting regularly. If you wait for it to happen, it'll just go dry. I think you need, and I'd certainly support on the government side, to have ongoing, because the groups meeting together, thinking up problems and solutions and formalising it now. And I mean, we'd certainly support groups doing that now rather than us having to find it. By the time we find each other, months and years go by and all the momentum gets lost.
Thanks. David Graydon, can I ask you, how do we coordinate all these different processes, the university, the clinicians, the engineers? How is it best done? Is it through the university or is it through the hospitals?
I'm not exactly sure, but I think that one of the things we've done at the university is that it's been sort of made clear to engineering that I'm the touch point. So if anybody at the moment receives a request for something, direct from a clinician, it comes to me. And I can be sort of like the eagle eye view of what's going on and put people in touch with each other. I'm also in touch with, the other divisions of the university, like the research office, the legal services, the advancement even for fundraising. And so we've sort of created these committees that are sort of still developing, but I think that they're getting into a really good position to be able to prioritize, because there's a lot of replication in terms of what we get approached about, and also there's there's some things that are seen as this needs to get done in a week, like with Jason and the face shields, versus some things that perhaps this would be worth developing, but perhaps Australia doesn't need it now. Maybe it's our neighbors that will need this. And so a good example of that is ventilators and designing low-cost sort of disposable ventilators. And so, the University of Melbourne has designed what I think is an excellent ventilator, but it's not one that we would probably need to manufacture for Australia, because, we have a good supply of sophisticated ones, but perhaps our neighbors would benefit a lot by having devices such as that. So one of the key things that we're looking to set up in ACMD is to sort of formalize this actually another Stanford model, which is the biodesign innovation process. So we've been running this subject as coursework for a while, and it's been very effective in bringing clinicians and engineers and business people together to find needs and then look for solutions. It's led to a number of startup companies. But I think to embed a program like that within a university is something that we perhaps need to set up earlier than later. A system where there are people who are part of the program all the time, who are specifically there to be that sort of engineering, clinical, business sort of contact. It can involve industry partners as well. It's important to do that. But I think that model is one that I think could serve us well into the future.
Great. Thanks, David. It's Tom. I'm just picking up a couple of questions from the Q&A. There's a question from Julie. I can't quite work out how to arrange for her to ask it live, but her question's for Jason, and it's, what's the future use of the hood post-COVID?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So it turns out that there's a lot of uncertainty about what aerosols are produced during various procedures. So in any infectious disease, whether it's just in influenza, could be spread around using these different procedures. And so this hood is going to protect for any infectious disease. And it's a much easier thing to do to pull down this hood over a patient that's receiving, say, CPAP or BiPAP or high flow oxygen than it is to secure the negative isolation room or use up the negative pressure isolation room, which you don't have that many of anyway. So I think long term for any infectious disease, this could be useful. And it's not necessarily something that will always be in the hospital, but it'll be used rather, but something that you could have in stock that you could just wheel out for any patient that you thought might be infectious.
Great, thank you. And one from Rob Capser for Cahal. How were the commercial entities differently responsive to you than before COVID? Before COVID-19, did you feel that it was easy to get the attention of companies, Cahal, in this period?
Yeah, certainly the engagement was much higher than usual. Obviously the motivations here, the amount of goodwill is just unprecedented, and so it is an opportunity to begin conversations that will hopefully become lasting ones. But certainly it has been a very different mode of interaction in this crisis than ever before in my experience.
And look, there are just a couple of panel members who we haven't asked anything, John, Darby and Davis. John, maybe you could say something about how that committee the task force that you're on is operating. And Davis, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how the hospital works to predict the demand of a pandemic like this. John, do you want to respond to that?
Okay, sure. I guess I'm helping to support Andrew, and there's a few other clinicians on that, but it does represent the health sector in general. There's some, from CEOs to GP, primary network directors. So it's quite a broad representation, and a few clinicians on there just help. And I guess I think I'm the only ID person, just providing a bit of input into that side. Just a couple of quick comments from reading the literature. A lot of the studies come out from the engineering world simulating vapors and aerosols, and I'm sure the audience here knows that, but some of that is certainly probably more analogous to jet fuel aerosols than to human aerosols. So we need to make sure the studies that we're doing actually look at realistically what might be produced by a human body and not by a machine, because some of the alarmist studies that have come out showing aerosols last for a day or two after a patient leaves the room may be completely irrelevant to actual patient experience. And it does actually do harm to a lot of the basic infection control policies that we have within hospitals. And just so I think it's great, we need all that literature, but it just needs to be converted to the actual biomedical environment we're in, and not necessarily just the engineering environment. Another comment, like how often do we clean our stethoscopes as clinicians? We know not very often. And many of the actual infections in early studies from Wuhan and elsewhere were actually due to people being unfamiliar with PPE and not putting on the basics. So it's actually just the basic, what we would call standard precautions that save us from a lot of these infections, rather than needed but sophisticated and costly engineering exercises. So very much for innovation and supportive, and we need to be aware of the limitations of that in a workplace where people are unfamiliar with things. So for instance, it might be good to give these people these face masks, but Claudia and Cathal, what are people doing with it? Are they wiping it? Are they just chucking it in their bag and using it at the next clinical encounter and then reinfecting themselves with things because they haven't been properly taught how to use it? So we need to think how these things interact with our normal daily work environments, because I know a lot of people sort of think it's a great solution and then go on to use it elsewhere. I'll pass on to Davis now to make some comments.
Thanks, everyone. It's been really interesting to hear about the challenges of tackling the shortage in devices and equipment. I think the hospital is also facing a shortage of epidemiologists to help with modelling, and that was the background for our group at SVI being put in touch with people at the hospital, so Mary Jo Waters ultimately, but my team has been working most closely with Eve Lorenzo and Luke Wilkinson to discuss the challenges of trying to predict what might be coming down the pipe for St Vincent, specifically in terms of hospitalised COVID-19 patients and the number of people that might end up in ICU there. That's been a challenge from our group. My group and I have a lot of experience in statistical modelling for genomics, but we're not epidemiologists or public health experts. Nevertheless, we've done our best to try and skill up in that regard, read the literature, and come up with a sort of a sensible, simple framework for taking the publicly available data and the hospital data and using these compartmental models that you've probably heard about to try and make some conservative, simple predictions or forecasts for the hospital. So you will surely have heard about the SIR models that are very popular for epidemiological modelling. We're using an extended version of that takes into account exposures, infections, quarantine or self-isolation, hospitalisation and case fatalities, as well as the standard susceptible, infectious, recovered compartments in the basic SIR model. So we've been running a lot of simulations based on that. The big challenges are that, compared to the standard way we like to think about statistical models, you have your data set and you try to estimate a small number of parameters as accurately as you can with some understanding of the uncertainty. What we have with applying these sort of models to COVID-19 data is we have moderately complicated models with lots of unknown parameters and a very small amount of data. So we're trying to be doing a lot of sort of sensitivity analyses to try and figure out what the plausible ranges of key parameters are, and then deliver our forecasts and also communicate the uncertainty we have in them to people at hospital. I guess the key things are, the good news is obviously case numbers are low at the moment, and so in the short term, that means our forecasts are also predicting low numbers, which is good. And we've also just sort of been keeping up in touch with Yves and Luke, and also just to keep our forecasts on a fairly short time frame. I think, like weather forecasts, we can be reasonably confident about what's happening in the next week or two. We've been very careful about saying anything, what's going to happen 3 or 4 months away. So yeah, so that's where we're at. We'll keep updating those, stay in touch with people at hospital and do our best there.
Thanks, Davis. We rely on yours and Yves' modelling for a lot of things in the hospital. So we watch with eagle eyes for each new forecast.
Excellent.
Okay, well, we're sort of out of time, and I'd just like to thank the presenters and all the speakers for joining us today, and for all the audience. We had over 100 people join today. If people have got questions which weren't answered, then maybe you could send them to Tom and he could distribute them to the appropriate people. Is that all right, Tom?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So thanks once again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll maybe do another one later on this year and see where we are.
Thanks very much, Anthony.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks. See ya.
Thank you. Bye.